The executioner's heavy footsteps echoed through the deathly silent throne room. Isolde was violently thrown onto the freezing obsidian floor. Her hands were raw, her omega dress reduced to filthy rags from the blizzard. Above her, the false Luna smirked, raising a manicured hand to order her immediate death. "Kill the trespassing Omega," Penelope hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Two massive guards drew their silver blades. Isolde didn't beg. She only curled her bruised body tighter around the heavy, dirt-stained woven basket she had dragged through the deadly snow. The pack sneered. They waited to see the weak Omega's blood spill. But before the executioner's blade could fall, the basket burst open. Out tumbled 3 silver-coated wolf pups. A collective gasp ripped through the great hall. The lost princes of Frostridge. The guards immediately dropped their swords and fell to their knees, reaching out to safely gather the royal heirs. But what happened next shattered the laws of the entire kingdom. Rowan, the eldest prince, didn't run to the safety of the throne. He spun around, bared his tiny fangs, and viciously snapped at the guard's armored hand. Then, all 3 royal pups scrambled back. They threw their small, shivering bodies over Isolde's bleeding shoulders. They buried their snouts into her tattered cloak and bared their teeth at the entire royal court, emitting a fierce, primal growl that demanded absolute submission. The pack stared in absolute horror. They looked down on the weak, despised Omega, but they had no idea that the Alpha King's 3 sons considered her their very lifeline. To the kingdom, she was a worthless traitor. To the princes, she was the mother who had swallowed poison to keep them breathing. On the high dais, a crystal wine goblet shattered. King Cedric, the most terrifying alpha in the realm, stepped down from his throne, his golden eyes burning as he realized his heirs were ready to go to war against his own pack, just to protect a broken Omega. But to understand how a despised, starved outcast came to hold the absolute fate of the Frostridge pack in her bleeding hands, one must look back. 10 days earlier, the winter of 1492 was unforgiving. It was a brutal, howling entity that swallowed the northern territories whole. At the very edge of the packlands, where the majestic silver pines gave way to the treacherous, barren slopes of the deadwood, lived Isolde. She was a pariah, an Omega stripped of all dignity, titles, and pack privileges. 10 years prior, her father, Alistair, a highly respected beta and the former captain of the guard, had been wrongfully accused of conspiring with rogue wolves. He was unceremoniously executed in the village square, framed by the very nobles who now sat comfortably in the warm castle. Isolde, only a teenager at the time, had inherited his supposed treason. The pack had not banished her. Banishment, in a way, would have been a mercy. Instead, they kept her as a living scapegoat, a symbol of their justice. They forced her to live in a dilapidated, drafty shack at the border, tasking her with the most grueling, degrading labors just to earn scraps of moldy bread and frozen meat. On this particular evening, the blizzard howled like a wounded beast. Isolde, wrapped in a threadbare gray cloak that offered absolutely no protection against the biting frost, dragged a heavy wooden sled of chopped firewood through knee-deep snow. Her fingers, wrapped in filthy, fraying bandages, were completely numb. Frost clung to her silver-blonde eyelashes, and her breaths came out in short, ragged plumes of white mist. Every step was agonizing. The cold seeped into her bones, but her spirit, forged in a decade of relentless abuse, refused to break. As she dragged her sled past the border patrol route, a sneering guard named Harold stepped out from the warmth of the watchtower. He was a cruel, heavy-set wolf who took immense pleasure in enforcing the pack's disdain for the traitor's daughter. Deliberately, Harold kicked a massive clump of dirty ice directly into Isolda's path. She couldn't stop in time. Her worn leather boots slipped, and she fell hard, her bruised knees slamming against the frozen earth. The sled tipped over, scattering her hours of back-breaking labor across the snow. Harold and his fellow guards erupted into cruel laughter.
"Watch your step, Omega."
Harold spat, leaning down so his hot, foul breath brushed her cheek. "You're as clumsy as your father was loyal. Pick it up. If you miss a single log, you won't get your grain ration this week." Isolde kept her piercing sapphire eyes locked on the snow. She bit her cracked lower lip, tasting the metallic tang of her own blood, swallowing the furious retort burning in her throat. Retaliation meant a whipping. A whipping in this weather meant an infection, and an infection meant death. She did not cry. She did not beg. She possessed a quiet, untouchable dignity that always seemed to infuriate her tormentors even more. With trembling, bruised hands, she simply gathered her fallen wood, restacked the sled, and kept moving into the darkening abyss of the forest. The guards' laughter eventually faded, swallowed by the roaring wind. Isolde strayed past the safe perimeter, venturing deep into the deadwood. It was suicide to go this far out. Rogue wolves and wild predators roamed these barren slopes. But she was desperate. A deep, agonizing cough had settled in her chest for weeks, and she needed to scavenge for medicinal winter root and willow bark beneath the snow to brew a remedy. She dropped to her knees at the base of a massive, twisted weeping willow tree, using a sharp stone to chip away at the ice. That was when she heard it. It was faint, almost completely drowned out by the blizzard, but Isolde's ears twitched. It was not the wind. It was a reedy, choked sound. A whimper. Isolde froze, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. She held her breath, listening intently. The sound came again. It was weaker this time, laced with a profound, terrifying agony that instantly bypassed her fears and tugged violently at her inherent maternal instincts. Abandoning her sled, she waded blindly through the waist-high snowdrifts, following the desperate sound toward the hollowed roots of the dead willow. Half buried beneath a pile of frozen leaves and heavy snow, she saw it. A heavy burlap sack. It was tied shut with a thick leather cord, and it was twitching feebly in the frost. Panic and curiosity warred within Isolde's chest. She dropped her sharp scavenging stone and frantically clawed at the frozen leather cord binding the burlap sack. Her fingers were numb, bleeding from the harsh ice, but she ignored the searing pain. The faint, reedy whimper sounded again, weaker this time, barely a breath against the howling wind. "Hold on," she whispered, her teeth chattering as she finally pried the frozen knot apart. She pulled the heavy burlap fabric down, and a sharp gasp tore from her raw throat. Inside the filthy sack lay 3 wolf pups. They were pitifully small, their usually magnificent silver-gray coats matted with ice, mud, and dried vomit. They were emaciated, their tiny ribs protruding sharply against their flanks. The sheer cruelty of the sight made Isolde's stomach churn. The largest of the 3 pups had thrown his own shivering body over his 2 smaller brothers in a desperate, futile attempt to shield them from the lethal frost. Isolde reached out a trembling hand. Pack law was absolute. Omegas were strictly forbidden from touching purebred pups without a direct, written order from a high-ranking noble. To be caught with stolen, high-born pups was an instant, undeniable death sentence. She knew she should walk away. Survival dictated she turn her back and disappear into the snow. But as her bruised fingers gently brushed the snout of the smallest pup, he let out a pathetic, shivering sigh and instinctively leaned into the warmth of her palm.
About time.
You are dying, she realized, a jolt of pure horror striking her heart. Drawing on the forbidden, ancient herbal knowledge passed down secretly from her late grandmother, Isolde leaned closer. Her sharp blue eyes caught something terrifying. Around the pup's tiny muzzles was a faint, purplish residue. It carried a sickly sweet, almost metallic scent that instantly made Isolde's blood run colder than the blizzard around her. Nightshade. These pups hadn't just been abandoned by a careless mother. They had been intentionally poisoned and left in the freezing abyss of the deadwood to suffer a slow, agonizing, and untraceable death. Tears pricked Isolde's eyes, freezing instantly on her pale lashes. Who could commit such an atrocity? She carefully wiped a patch of frozen mud from the largest pup's chest to check his heartbeat. As the grime flaked away, her breath completely left her lungs. There, stamped naturally into the pristine silver fur right above the pup's racing heart, was a distinct marking. It was a golden crescent moon intertwined with 3 stars. Isolde fell backward, scrambling until her spine hit the rough bark of the dead willow tree. Her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a scream of absolute terror. Every wolf in the territory knew that mark. It was the royal crest, a genetic birthmark carried only by the Alpha King's direct lineage. She hadn't just stumbled upon abandoned pups. She had found the lost princes of Frost Ridge, the very heirs King Cedric was currently tearing the kingdom apart to find. Her brilliant mind raced, piecing together the lethal political puzzle. The village guards had gossiped about a rogue ambush on the royal carriage, but rogues did not possess Nightshade. Nightshade was a delicate, incredibly rare plant that only grew in the climate-controlled royal glasshouses at Castle du Nord. It was strictly guarded by the royal physicians. This meant the rogues hadn't tried to kill the pups. Someone inside the castle, someone with immense power and access to the royal gardens, had ordered the assassination of the king's children. Panic, sharp as a dagger, pierced Isolde's chest. If you turn them in to the border guards right now, the traitor who ordered this assassination would know the pup survived. Harold and his men would likely slaughter her on the spot for kidnapping them, and then finish the job the Nightshade started. She was an outcast Omega. No one would believe her. Another choked gasp escaped the smallest prince. His tiny body arched as a violent tremor racked his spine. The poison was reaching his nervous system. Isolde looked up at the darkening, merciless sky. "Damn the laws," she whispered fiercely to the roaring wind. "Damn the pack, and damn my wretched life." If she was going to die, she would die fighting to save something innocent. Moving with a frantic, protective defiance, Isolde unclasped her tattered gray cloak. She stripped it from her own shoulders, exposing her fragile body to the lethal, biting frost. She carefully wrapped the thick wool around the 3 shivering princes, bundling them tightly against her chest. The cold immediately bit into her skin like 1,000 needles, but she ignored it. Running on pure adrenaline and the desperate need to protect the lives fading in her arms, Isolde began the grueling trek back to her dilapidated cabin. She stumbled through the waist-high drifts, her vision blurring, her bare arms turning a dangerous shade of blue. But every time her knees threatened to buckle, she felt the faint, rhythmic thumping of 3 tiny hearts against her chest. When she finally kicked open the rotting wooden door of her shack and collapsed inside, she was half dead from the cold. But as she laid the bundled princes onto the floorboards, she knew the hardest part had just begun. The blizzard had not killed them, but the nightshade was already in their blood. Once inside her dilapidated shack, the real battle began. The cabin was barely warmer than the outside, the savage wind whistling through the cracks in the rotting wooden planks. Isolde's entire body shook violently from the cold, her wet, thin Omega dress clinging to her freezing skin. But she could not stop. If she stopped moving, the princes would die. She immediately threw her scavenged wood into the stone hearth, using her very last precious drop of lamp oil to coax a roaring fire. She laid the 3 bundles of silver fur onto her only possession of value, a worn woolen blanket her late mother had woven, pulling it close to the flickering fire. Light. She examined them quickly, her hands steady despite the frost in her joints. They were fading fast, their tiny chests hitched with shallow, erratic breaths, and their bodies were racked with feverish tremors. The nightshade was aggressively attacking their systems. Drawing on the forbidden herbal knowledge she had secretly memorized from her grandmother's destroyed texts, Isolde frantically went to work. She grabbed chunks of raw, burned charcoal from the edge of the hearth and crushed them against a smooth stone. She mixed the black powder with hot water and ground willow bark, creating a thick, bitter slurry designed to bind to the deadly toxins in their stomachs. For the next 10 hours, Isolde did not rest for a single second. She knelt on the hard floorboards, forcing the charcoal mixture down their tiny throats, drop by agonizing drop. When the poison made them violently reject the medicine, she gently wiped their muzzles with a clean rag and patiently started all over again.
Is someone there?
She heated small river stones in the fire, wrapped them in scraps of fabric, and carefully packed them around the pups to steadily raise their dropping body temperatures. As the night dragged on, the blizzard outside raged, but inside the cabin, a quiet, desperate magic took hold. Isolde stripped off her wet, freezing clothes, wrapping herself in a dry, threadbare sheet. She pulled the 3 royal pups against her bare chest, pouring every ounce of her own meager warmth into their shivering bodies. She hummed a low, ancient pack lullaby, a song of the moon and the silver pines. It was in Omega's instinctual, soothing melody, one she hadn't sung since her father was executed. By dawn, the brutal storm had finally broken, leaving an eerie, heavy silence in its wake. Isolde collapsed back against the wooden floorboards, her muscles screaming in agony, exhausted to her very bones. But as she looked toward the hearth, a weak, beautiful smile broke across her pale face. The largest pup stirred. Rowan opened a pair of striking, piercing sapphire eyes. He blinked against the morning light, looked directly at Isolde, and let out a tiny, demanding yip. He weakly nudged his younger brothers, Liam and Finn, who yawned and stretched their small paws. The purplish hue had completely faded from their gums. Their breathing was even and strong. They were going to live. Isolde let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 10 years. She sat up, fetching a small bowl of warm goat's milk she had bartered her winter boots to obtain days ago. She dipped a clean rag into the milk, letting the starving princess suckle hungrily at her calloused fingertips. As she gently washed the remaining dried mud and charcoal from their chests, the golden crescent moon and 3 stars shone brilliantly against their silver fur. The royal crests. There was no denying it now. She was harboring the very future of the kin. "You brave, beautiful boys," she whispered, a tear finally escaping her eye and tracking down her dirt-smudged cheek. Rowan playfully nipped at her thumb, his tiny tail giving a weak wag. For a fleeting moment, Isolde felt a profound, overwhelming warmth.
Just for a moment.
A strange, humming connection anchored itself in her chest, whispering that she was no longer alone in this cruel world. But the peace was shattered instantly. A heavy, terrifying sound echoed through the frozen scraps. It started as a low baying in the distance, but quickly multiplied. Hunting hounds. Isolde's blood ran ice cold. She scrambled to the small frosted window and peered through the cracks. Marching through the knee-deep snow, heavily armed and flanked by massive, snarling tracking hounds, was the royal guard. Leading them was Harold, his sword already drawn, kicking his way through the border village. "Search every hovel," Harold's booming voice ordered, cutting through the crisp morning air. "The king commands it. Tear up the floorboards if you must. Any wolf found hiding anything will be executed on the spot." Isolde backed away from the window, her heart hammering so violently she was certain the guards could hear it from outside. Harold's patrol wasn't just doing a routine check. They were actively hunting for the princes. And if the traitor who poisoned the pups had paid Harold off, he wasn't here to rescue them. He was here to finish the job. She looked down at the 3 royal pups, who were now looking up at her with trusting, innocent eyes. Heavy, mud-caked boots crunched on the snow right outside her door. She had mere seconds before they broke it down. Moving with frantic, blind desperation, Isolde rolled back the threadbare rug covering the center of her floor. She wedged her bleeding fingers into the cracks and pried up the heavy, loose wooden plank that concealed her tiny, freezing root cellar. It was a shallow hole carved into the frozen earth, damp and smelling of rot, barely large enough to hide a small sack of potatoes. It was freezing, but it was their only chance. "Shh, little ones," Isolde whispered, her voice cracking as tears spilled onto their silver fur. She quickly lowered the 3 princes into the dark, cold earth. "Not a sound. I beg you. Not a single sound." She threw her late mother's worn woolen blanket over them to muffle any noise and retain what little warmth they had left. She slammed the floorboard back into place, kicked the rug over it, and hastily dragged her heavy, broken wooden chair over the exact spot. She had barely managed to sit down and grab a piece of torn fabric to feign mending when the door to her cabin was violently kicked open. The rusted hinges tore from the dry-rotted wood. The door slammed against the interior wall with a deafening crack. The biting winter wind howled into the small room, swirling the ashes in the hearth and extinguishing the last of the fire's warmth. Harold stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the morning light. He was flanked by 2 heavily armored royal guards, their silver swords drawn and gleaming menacingly. The massive tracking hounds strained against their leather leashes, sniffing the air aggressively. Isolde's blood ran cold. The scent of the charcoal and willow bark was strong, but would it be enough to mask the scent of the royal bloodline beneath her feet? Harold sneered, his dark eyes darting around the pathetic one-room shack. "Well, well, the traitor's daughter," Harold mocked, stepping inside. His heavy, mud-caked boots thudded against the rotting floorboards. "Let's see what filth you're hiding, Omega." Isolde sat frozen in her chair. She kept her head bowed, her eyes cast downward in the customary, submissive posture demanded of Omegas. But beneath her ribs, her heart hammered so violently, she was certain the guards could hear it. Directly below her chair, hidden only by a thin rug and a single plank of wood, the 3 true heirs to the Frost Ridge throne lay in suffocating darkness. If Rowan, Liam, or Finn made even the softest whimper, her life, and the future of the kingdom, would end in a pool of blood on her living room floor. Harold began to tear her cabin apart. He kicked over her small wooden table, sending her meager collection of chipped clay bowls crashing against the stone heart. He ran his sword along the edge of her miserable mattress, slicing the thin fabric and laughing as the dry straw spilled out onto the floor. "You live like a rat, Isolde," Harold spat. He stepped closer, his heavy boot planting itself mere inches from the edge of the rug beneath her chair. Isolde's breath hitched. She braced her muscles, fully prepared to throw her fragile body between the guard's swords and the floorboard, if necessary. She would die before she let them touch the pups. "Are you hiding anything for the rogues?" Harold demanded, leaning down to grab her by the chin, forcing her to look at him. His grip was bruising, his claws pricking her skin. "Any stolen meat? Any silver?" "No, sir," Isolde whispered, keeping her voice steady despite the terror gripping her throat. "I have nothing, only the frost and the wood I chop." Harold stared into her piercing sapphire eyes, searching for a lie. The silence in the cabin stretched on, heavy and absolute.
I knew it.
Beneath the floorboards, the pups remained remarkably, fiercely quiet. It was a testament to the stoic discipline of their alpha bloodline.
It's here.
Even in infancy, even freezing and terrified in the dark, they sensed the lethal danger radiating from the men above and held their breath. Disgusted by the squalor and finding nothing of value, Harold shoved Isolde's face away. "Keep your head down, Omega," he snarled, turning toward the door. "The king is losing his mind looking for his sons. If you see anything suspicious, you report it to me immediately, or we'll hang you in the square, right next to where your traitor father rotted." With a final contemptuous kick to her empty wooden bucket, Harold marched out into the snow, his guards and hounds following close behind. Isolde did not move a muscle until the wind completely carried the sound of the hounds fading into the distance. The moment they were gone, she collapsed to the floor. She frantically shoved the chair aside, threw back the rug, and pried up the floorboard. The three pups blinked up at her from the dark hole. They were shivering violently from the damp earth, their silver fur standing on end. But they were alive. Rowan, the largest, let out a tiny, indignant huff and immediately licked Isolde's tear-stained cheek as she lifted them out of the cold cellar. "You brave, beautiful boys," she sobbed softly, burying her face in their warm fur. "You saved us." But the relief was incredibly fleeting. Isolde looked at her destroyed cabin and the dying embers in the hearth. She knew she could not stay in the scraps. Harold's patrol was just the first wave. King Cedric's desperation would soon drive the guards to tear the border villages down to the very soil. Furthermore, she could not trust the military. If a high-ranking noble had ordered the poisoning, handing the pups over to the border guards was a death sentence. She had to bypass the chain of command entirely. She had to reach King Cedric himself. But Castle Dunor was miles away, sitting atop the highest peaks of the moor, the territory. The main roads were heavily guarded, meaning she would have to take the hidden, treacherous path through the jagged mountains known as the White Pass. It was a journey that killed fully grown alpha warriors in the winter, and she was just a starved Omega. Isolde picked up the heavy, dirt-stained burlap sack. She looked at the three royal pups, their sapphire eyes watching her every move. "We are going to the king," she promised them, her voice hardening with newfound resolve. To bypass the heavily guarded main roads, Isolde had to take the White Pass. It was a jagged, treacherous route carved through the spines of the northern mountains, notorious for swallowing seasoned alpha warriors whole during the winter months. For a starved, outcast Omega carrying three pups, It was practically a death sentence. But it was the only way to reach King Cedric without being intercepted by Harold's corrupt patrol. Before leaving her ruined cabin, Isolde fashioned a secure carrier. She wrapped the 3 sleeping princes tightly in her mother's woven woolen blanket, keeping them pressed directly against the bare skin of her chest for maximum body heat. Over that, she wore her tattered gray dress, and finally, she cut open the heavy, dirt-stained burlap sack, using it as a rugged outer layer to shield them from the biting wind. With her frayed boots tightly laced and a sharp walking stick in her bruised hands, she stepped out into the blinding white abyss. For 3 days and 2 nights, the journey tested the very limits of Isolde's mortal endurance. The snow was waist-deep. Every step required a monumental effort, her muscles screaming in agony, her lungs burning with a persistent, rattling cough. Aerial scout patrols, massive wolves navigating the ridges, passed overhead twice a day. Whenever Isolde heard the crunch of snow or the distant howl of the guards, she would throw herself into shallow ice caves or bury herself under the roots of fallen pine trees, holding her breath until her vision spotted with black dots. Through it all, the royal pups remained her anchor. Rowan, Liam, and Finn possessed an ancient, instinctual understanding of their perilous situation. They did not whine. They did not cry. Hidden beneath the rough burlap and wool, they remained fiercely silent whenever danger approached. But the cold was relentless, and hunger was a far more vicious enemy. Isolde had managed to salvage 1 small piece of dried, salted venison and a heel of moldy bread from her destroyed cabin. She ate none of it. On the second night, huddled inside a narrow fissure in the mountain rock, the wind screaming outside, Isolde carefully chewed the dried meat to soften it. With freezing, trembling fingers, she fed the meager scraps to the ravenous pups. Rowan swallowed his portion, then looked up at Isolde's hollow, sunken cheeks. The tiny alpha heir nudged a small crumb of the meat back toward her hand with his wet nose, letting out a soft, demanding whine. A choked sob caught in Isolde's throat. "No, little one," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. She gently stroked his silver head. "You need your strength to rule. I am thin." To stave off the agonizing hunger pangs twisting her stomach into knots, she gathered green pine needles from the edge of the cave and chewed on them, swallowing the bitter sap just to have something in her belly. As she drifted into a dangerous, freezing sleep, she felt a shift against her chest. The 3 pups did not just huddle for their own warmth. Instinctively, they spread their small bodies across her collarbones and heart. Even in infancy, their royal alpha blood ran hotter than a normal wolf's. They pressed their silver fur against her freezing skin, essentially becoming 3 tiny, living furnaces. They were keeping her alive just as fiercely as she was protecting them. By the evening of the 3rd day, the blizzard finally broke, giving way to a crisp, clear twilight. Isolde dragged her heavy, frost-bitten feet up the final ridge. Her knees buckled, and she fell hard into the snow, the walking stick slipping from her numb fingers. She lay there for a moment, her breathing shallow, ready to let the cold take her. But Rowan squirmed against her chest, letting out a sharp, encouraging yip. Isolde forced her heavy eyes open and looked down into the valley. There, towering against the darkening sky and illuminated by thousands of glowing silver torches, was Castle du Nord. The massive obsidian walls looked impregnable, a fortress of power and absolute authority. But as Isolde forced herself to her feet, leaning heavily against a boulder, she noticed something terrifying. Ying. The castle was glowing with unnatural brilliance. The grand courtyards were packed with carriages belonging to the neighboring alpha packs. Massive banners of midnight blue and silver were draped across the battlements. It was the winter solstice. A chill deeper than the snow settled into Isolda's bones. The winter solstice banquet was a sacred, mandatory gathering of every high-ranking noble and pack elder in the territory. And according to the rumors Harold had spat at the borders, tonight was the night Lady Penelope intended to officially announce her regency alongside her father, using the king's grief-stricken madness as an excuse to seize control of the Frost Ridge pack. The main gates were swarming with elite royal guards. There was no way a filthy, unrecognized Omega would be allowed within a mile of the throne room. If she marched up to the front gates, the guards would arrest her, discover the pups, and execute her in the dungeons before King Cedric even knew she existed. She needed to get inside the Great Hall. She needed to expose the truth in front of everyone, where the traitors could not hide it in the shadows. Isolde looked down at the filthy burlap sack covering her chest. "We are going in through the kitchens," she whispered to the pups, her piercing sapphire eyes hardening with a quiet, lethal resolve. "Keep quiet, my princes. We are going to take back your throne." The shadows of Castle du Nord provided the perfect cover for a ghost. The chaos of the winter solstice banquet was in full swing. Carriages of visiting Alpha Lords clogged the main gates, allowing Isolde to slip unnoticed through the rear delivery entrances. The overpowering scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and pine sap rolling out of the massive castle kitchens masked her natural Omega scent, which was already heavily buried beneath days of frost, mud, and the sharp tang of willow bark. Her stomach violently cramped at the smell of the rich food, but she bit her cracked lip and pushed deeper into the labyrinth of the servants' corridors. She needed a disguise. Carrying a filthy burlap sack into the upper levels would draw instant suspicion. In a deserted laundry alcove, she found a heavy, dirt-stained woven basket used for collecting soiled linens. Moving quickly, she gently transferred the 3 sleeping pups, still bundled in their burlap and wool, into the bottom of the basket, covering them lightly with a discarded servant's apron. "Stay low," she breathed, her hands trembling as she gripped the woven handles. "We are almost there." Dragging the heavy basket, Isolde navigated the winding stone staircases, her frost-bitten feet leaving faint, watery footprints on the pristine marble. As she ascended, the air grew thicker, heavy with the oppressive, suffocating aura of hundreds of dominant wolves gathered in one place. She finally reached the towering oak doors of the obsidian throne hall. 2 massive royal guards, clad in silver armor, crossed their halberds with a sharp clang, completely blocking her path. "Kitchens are downstairs, Omega," the guard on the left barked, his nose wrinkling in absolute disgust at her tattered, filthy appearance. "Get lost before I throw you in the dungeons." "I have a delivery for the king," Isolde rasped, her throat raw from the winter wind, but her piercing sapphire eyes refused to lower. "It is a matter of life and death." "The king sees no one," the second guard laughed cruelly. He reached out and violently shoved Isolde backward by her fragile shoulders. She stumbled, her bruised knees buckling, but she refused to let go of the basket. The violent motion caught the attention of the nobles standing near the entrance. The heavy oak doors were cracked open, and through the gap, Isolde saw the nightmare unfolding inside. The great hall was draped in heavy, mournful black. At the head of the room, King Cedric slumped on his obsidian throne. He looked like a shattered ghost of the legendary warrior he was. His golden eyes were bloodshot and clouded, his skin clammy. The castle physicians blamed his rapid decline on grief, but Isolde, a healer, recognized the symptoms instantly. He was being poisoned. slow, microscopic drops of nightshade in his wine, designed to mimic a breaking heart. Standing right beside him was Lady Peony Lope. Resplendent in a gown of midnight blue silk, holding a crystal goblet, she was addressing the hushed crowd. And so, as our beloved king's grief has taken his strength, I will step forward. My father, Lord Reginald, and I shall take the mantle of regency to guide this pack through its darkest. No! Isolde screamed. Drawing on the very last reserve of adrenaline in her starved body, Isolde lunged forward, throwing her entire weight against the heavy oak doors. They burst wide open, slamming against the stone walls with a deafening, explosive thud that instantly silenced the massive room. Hundreds of eyes snapped toward the entrance. There, looking like a battered, half-starved apparition, stood the outcast Omega, dragging a dirt-stained woven basket. Lady Penelope shrieked from the high dais, her carefully crafted composure instantly shattering at the sight of the very woman whose father her family had framed for treason. Panic flashed in Penelope's eyes. "Guards!" Penelope hissed, her voice echoing shrilly across the hall. "Seize that filthy trespasser! Execute her immediately for interrupting the king's mourning!" Before Isolde could speak a single word of truth, the two guards at the door grabbed her by her thin, freezing arms. She was violently thrown forward, sliding across the freezing obsidian floor until she came to a halt at the bottom of the dais steps. The executioner, present for the traditional solstice rites, stepped out from the shadows, his heavy footsteps echoing. "Kill the trespassing Omega," Penelope ordered again, gripping her crystal goblet, her knuckles turning white. Two massive guards drew their silver blades. Isolde didn't beg. She knew the cruelty of this pack better than anyone. She only curled her bruised, freezing body tighter around the heavy, dirt-stained woven basket she had dragged through the deadly snow. The pack sneered. The visiting nobles whispered in disgust. They waited to see the weak Omega's blood spill. But before the executioner's blade could fall, the basket burst open. Out tumbled three incredibly healthy, silver-coated wolf pups. They shook off the burlap and wool, blinking fiercely against the bright torchlight. A collective, deafening gasp ripped through the great hall. The lost princes of Frost Ridge. The guards immediately dropped their swords. The clatter of steel against stone was the only sound in the room as the soldiers fell to their knees, reaching out in sheer disbelief to safely gather the royal heirs. But what happened next shattered the laws of the entire kingdom. Rowan, the eldest prince, didn't run to the safety of the throne. He spun around, bared his tiny fangs, and viciously snapped at the guard's armored hand. Then, all three royal pups scrambled back. They threw their small, shivering bodies over Isolde's bleeding shoulder. They buried their snouts into her tattered cloak and bared their teeth at the entire royal court, emitting a fierce, primal growl that demanded absolute submission. The pack stared in absolute horror. They looked down on the weak, despised Omega. But they had no idea that the Alpha King's three sons considered her their very lifeline. To the kingdom, she was a worthless traitor. To the princes, she was the mother who had swallowed poison to keep them breathing. On the high dais, the crystal wine goblet slipped from King Cedric's hand and shattered into 1,000 pieces. The sound was like a gunshot. Through the thick fog of the Borgia-style poison clouding his brain, a primal electrifying surge of pure alpha adrenaline violently flushed the toxins from Cedric's veins. His lichen roared to the surface, breaking the chains of his grief. His sons were alive, and they were ready to go to war against his own pack to protect a broken Omega. King Cedric, the most terrifying alpha in the realm, slowly stepped down from his obsidian throne. The immense, crushing weight of his power slammed into the room, forcing every single wolf, including Lady Penelope, to their knees. His glowing golden eyes locked onto the frail, shivering woman kneeling on his floor, shielded by his bloodline. "Who?" Cedric rumbled, his voice shaking the very frost from the castle walls. "Drew a blade on the savior of my house?" "Who drew a blade on the savior of my house?" King Cedric's voice was not a yell. It was a low, devastating rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and settled deep into the bones of every wolf in the room. The two guards who had dragged Isolde dropped their swords entirely, pressing their foreheads flat against the freezing stone. They were trembling violently, unable to speak, paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating weight of the Alpha King's true power. Cedric walked down the final steps of the dais. The crowd parted instantly, nobles shrinking back into the shadows, terrified of the lethal fury radiating from their ruler. He stopped inches away from Isolde. The three royal pups, recognizing the scent of their father, let out joyous, high-pitched yips. Yet, fiercely loyal, Rowan and Liam kept their front paws planted firmly on Isolde's tattered cloak, as if telling the king himself that she was under their protection. Tears finally breached Cedric's glowing golden eyes. The ruthless warrior, a man who bowed to absolutely no one, slowly fell to one knee on the hard stone. He reached out a massive, trembling hand and gently cupped Rowan's tiny head. He traced his thumb over the pristine silver fur of the pup's chest, right where the golden crescent moon and 3 stars shone brightly. "My sons," Cedric breathed, his voice breaking. "You are alive." "It is a trick!" Lady Penelope shrieked from the high table, her face flushed with sudden, undeniable terror. Her regal facade crumbled entirely. "Those are rogue pups. It is a cruel illusion meant to destabilize the throne. Guards, kill the pups and the Omega." "Silence!" Cedric roared. The sheer force of his alpha command shattered the remaining glass on the nobles' tables and forced Penelope to her knees, clutching her ears in agony. Cedric looked from his healthy, fierce sons down to the woman shielding them. Isolde was kneeling in the dirt and melted snow. Her breath was ragged, her lips blue from the cold, her hands wrapped in filthy, blood-stained bandages. And yet, she did not look away from him. Her sapphire eyes were clear, holding a quiet, unbreakable dignity. "They recognized her," Isolde spoke up. Her voice was raspy, but it rang clear and steady across the dead silent hall. She gently placed a protective hand over Finn's back. "The pups recognized the scent of the woman who ordered their deaths." Penelope scrambled backward on the dais, her silk gown tangling around her legs. "You lie, you wretched, filthy Omega! I am your future queen!" "They were poisoned," Isolde stated fiercely, ignoring the false Luna and keeping her eyes locked with the king. "I found them freezing in the deadwood, tied inside a burlap sack. They were fed nightshade, King Cedric, a massive dose. I spent the last 10 days using charcoal and willow bark to pull them back from the brink of death." A collective gasp echoed through the world, to the court. Nightshade was a royal poison. Only the highest nobles had access to it. Isolde raised a trembling, bruised finger, pointing directly at the puddle of wine from Cedric's shattered goblet on the dais. "The pups had a purplish residue on their gums. It is a signature of synthesized nightshade," Isolde continued, her medical knowledge undeniable. And if your royal physicians examine the wine you are just drinking, King Cedric, they will find the exact same extract. She hasn't just been mourning you. She has been slowly poisoning you to steal your throne. Cedric's golden eyes snapped toward Penelope, glowing with a lethal, blinding intensity. He didn't need to say a word. The chief royal physician, trembling in his robes, hurried forward to the dais. He knelt beside the shattered goblet, carefully dipping a silver testing strip into the spilled wine. He held it up to the torchlight. The silver instantly tarnished, turning a sickly, dark purple. The physician turned paler than the snow outside. The Omega is correct, my king. It is pure, concentrated nightshade oil. The great hall erupted into absolute chaos. Lord Reginald, Penelope's father, drew his sword and tried to flee toward the exit, but Cedric's elite guard tackled him to the ground in seconds, disarming him brutally. Penelope sobbed, crawling toward the steps of the dais, her false crown slipping from her perfectly styled hair and clattering uselessly against the stone. Mercy, Cedric. Please. They told me to do it. The council. Strip her of her titles, Cedric commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth, cutting off her pathetic pleas. Take her and her father to the deepest, coldest cells of the dungeon. They will be executed for high treason at dawn, and any council member who aided them will join them. The guards showed no hesitation this time. They dragged the screaming, thrashing, false Luna out of the hall. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate. The room plunged back into a terrified silence. The pack, the nobles who had just sneered at Isolde, the guards who had thrown her to the floor, the elders who had allowed her father to be executed, now realized the magnitude of their sin. They had just ordered the execution of the woman who saved the entire royal bloodline. One by one, the nobles lowered their heads. The guards bowed deeply. The entire court of Frost Ridge knelt in profound, burning shame before the bruised, starving Omega they had spent a decade treating like dirt. The massive Alpha King slowly turned his full attention back to Isolde. The danger had passed. The traitors were exposed. But the woman before him was swaying, her meager strength finally giving out. The immediate danger had passed. The traitors were dragged away to face their executions, and the once arrogant pack remained frozen on their knees in absolute burning shame. But King Cedric did not spare a single glance for his kneeling court. His full attention was anchored entirely on the fragile, shivering woman sitting on the freezing stone floor, surrounded by his 3 sons. The brutal toll of the winter, the starvation, and the grueling trek through the White Pass had finally caught up to her. Isolde swayed, her piercing sapphire eyes fluttering shut as her meager strength began to completely give out. Cedric moved with terrifying speed, yet his touch was impossibly gentle. He dropped to his knees right in front of her, casting his massive shadow over her shivering frame to block the drafts of the hall. He unclasped his heavy, fur-lined royal cloak and wrapped it securely around Isolde's trembling shoulders, covering the tattered, freezing rags of her Omega dress. "You," Cedric rumbled, his deep voice thick with a profound, overwhelming emotion. "An outcast, starved and forgotten by my own laws, braved the deadly winter, and defied my guards to save the very future of this kingdom." Isolde opened her heavy eyes, looking up into the glowing golden gaze of the Alpha King. She was so cold, but the heavy cloak carried his warmth, grounding her. "What is your name, savior of my blood?" Cedric asked softly, leaning closer. "Isolde, my king," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She swallowed hard, her inherent dignity refusing to let her hide her lineage. Daughter of Alice.
Ter.
Cedric's golden eyes widened slightly as the devastating realization hit him. Alistair, the honorable beta and former captain of the guard, the man who had been executed for treason 10 years ago, a treason supposedly uncovered by Lord Reginald, Penelope's father. The entire conspiracy unraveled before Cedric's very eyes. Reginald had framed an innocent man to eliminate a loyal captain, paving the way for his daughter to eventually seize the throne. The pack had spent a decade tormenting the daughter of a true, loyal hero. Your father was an honorable man, Isolde, Cedric vowed, his voice rising just enough so the kneeling court could hear every single damning word. His name, and yours, is cleared from this day forward. Any wolf who speaks otherwise will answer to my claws. He reached out, his massive, warm hand gently grasping her bruised, bandage-wrapped fingers to help her stand. The very second their skin touched, the world stopped. A violent, electrifying shockwave rippled outward from their hands, sweeping across the great hall and extinguishing every silver torch on the walls for a split second before they roared back to life, burning twice as bright. Isolde gasped, her eyes flying wide open. The bone-deep cold in her body was instantly eradicated, replaced by a rushing, impossible warmth that flooded her veins. Cedric froze. His golden alpha eyes flared with a blinding, primal intensity. Suddenly, the heavy, suffocating scent of the great hall. I was swept away. The air filled with the intoxicating ancient scent of wild pine, fresh snow, and old magic. It was a scent that completely bypassed Cedric's logical mind and struck directly at the soul of his lichen. It was the mate spark. For 10 days, the bond had been completely masked by the smell of freezing mud, the sharp tang of willow bark, and the lethal scent of nightshade. But now, stripped of the deception and the danger, the ancient magic of the wolves recognized the absolute truth. The Alpha King had not just found the savior of his children. He had found his fated mate. The ancient magic had not chosen a pampered noble. It had recognized the purest, most resilient soul in the entire kingdom. Cedric looked down at the woman in his arms. She was battered, bruised, and wearing a filthy burlap sack. But to him, and to his roaring wolf, she was the most breathtaking creature to ever walk the earth. Mate, Cedric breathed, the word carrying the weight of a sacred vow. Rowan, Liam, and Finn, sensing the shift in the bond, pressed against Isolde's legs, letting out joyous, vibrating purrs. Isolde looked around the grand hall. The nobles, the guards, the very people who had spat on her and called her a worthless Omega, were now bowing with their foreheads pressed to the floor. They were not bowing out of fear of the king. They were bowing in profound reverence to the woman who had conquered death to save their future. She had walked into the deadwood expecting to die. She was walking out as the absolute, untouchable queen of Frost Ridge. A true queen is not made by a golden crown. She is revealed by the quiet dignity that no amount of cruelty could ever take from her. What was your favorite moment of Isolde's incredible journey? If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more emotional Alpha King and rejected Luna stories, and come back for the next one.